The shuttle descended through purple clouds that swirled like oil on water. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her hand against the viewport, watching the alien world grow larger below. Her heart hammered in her chest. 300 years of searching across the stars, and they had finally found them. A species on the edge of everything important. The Vraxi lived in crude stone structures along the endless coastline of their world. They used simple tools made from bone and rock. They hunted in organized packs that showed tactical thinking. They made art on cave walls that displayed abstract concepts, but their eyes held something special. Something that made every human who looked into them feel a spark of recognition. Intelligence waiting to bloom like a flower in spring. Are we absolutely sure about this? Captain Rodriguez asked from the pilot seat. His hands trembled slightly on the controls, making the shuttle wobble in the atmosphere. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. We'll change them forever. Sarah smiled, though her stomach churned with nervousness and excitement mixed together. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment. She had studied anthropology, biology, ethics, and a dozen other fields. She had sacrificed relationships, children of her own, a normal life, all for this. Humanity didn't claw its way out of caves and up to the stars just to keep it all for ourselves. We have a moral responsibility to share what we've learned. What would we be if we kept this gift locked away? The first contact took months of careful, patient work. The Vraxi were naturally cautious creatures, hiding in their caves when the strange beings arrived in their impossibly loud flying machines. But humans knew how to wait. They had learned patience from their own difficult history. They left gifts at the cave entrances. Food that was safe and delicious, tools that made work easier, simple machines that demonstrated basic principles of physics. Slowly, gradually, the Vraxi emerged from their hiding places. Their long, delicate fingers touched the offerings with wonder and careful investigation. The first Vraxi to approach a human was a young female. She came at dawn when the light was soft and gentle. She touched Sarah's hand with one finger, then jerked back. Sarah stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The Vraxi touched again, more confident this time. Then she made a sound, a clicking noise that came from deep in her throat. Sarah clicked back, imitating the sound as best she could. The Vraxi's eyes widened. She clicked again, a different pattern. Sarah clicked back. It was the beginning of everything. Within a single generation, young Vraxi were learning human languages with the quick adaptability of children everywhere. They learned to read and write. They learned mathematics and basic science. Within 2 generations, they built their first school, a beautiful structure that combined human architectural principles with Vraxi aesthetic sensibilities. Within 3 generations, they looked up at their 2 moons with instruments they had built themselves and dreamed of, touching them with their own hands. The Terran Uplift Council poured resources into the Kepler 442b system like water into dry ground. Teachers arrived by the thousands. Volunteers who believed in the mission with religious fervor. Engineers helped build cities that were marvels of design, combining the best of human knowledge with Vraxi needs. Scientists shared knowledge that had taken humanity 10,000 years to accumulate, compressing millennia into decades. The Vraxi absorbed it all like dry earth drinking rain after a drought. They were hungry for knowledge, desperate to understand the universe that had been hidden from them. Commander James Park watched from the orbital station as the first major Vraxi city lit up at night. Electricity coursed through copper wires. Clean water flowed through pipes. Information zipped across the internet they had helped the Vraxi build. The light spread across the dark landscape like stars coming to life. He felt tears on his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. He felt like a proud father watching his child take their first steps into a larger world. "We're doing the right thing," he told his second officer, a woman named Martinez who had been with him for 15 years. "Look at them down there. In just 80 years, they've gone from chipping rocks to building computers. Imagine what they'll achieve in another century. Imagine what they'll contribute to galactic civilization." But not everyone celebrated the success. Back on Earth and throughout human space, the conservative factions grew louder with each Vraxi achievement. They organized protests in major cities. They published papers and books arguing their position. They claimed humanity was playing God, that uplifting other species was dangerous and arrogant. They said every species should evolve naturally at their own pace without interference. They warned of terrible consequences that would come from disrupting the natural order. The Uplift Council ignored the critics. They had ethics committees and oversight boards. They had rules and guidelines. Most importantly, they had the Vraxi themselves as proof. The Vraxi proved the critics wrong with every achievement, every breakthrough, every work of art. They weren't just copying humans like parrots, repeating sounds. They were becoming something unique and beautiful, something that blended human gifts with their own inherent nature. The Vraxi developed their own music that made human musicians weep with its complexity and emotional depth. They wrote literature that explored themes human writers had never considered. They created philosophical traditions that asked questions humanity had never thought to ask. They weren't becoming humans with purple skin. They were becoming fully realized Vraxi, with all the potential that had always been locked inside them. 100 years passed in what felt like moments. The Vraxi built starships with human guidance, sleek vessels that combined human engineering with Vraxi innovation. They established colonies on their 2 moons, turning barren rocks into living habitats. They pushed outward to nearby planets, terraforming and settling with the enthusiasm of a young species discovering its power. Their population grew from a few million primitives to billions of citizens spread across multiple worlds. They created art galleries that attracted visitors from across human space. They wrote equations that solved problems humanity had struggled with for generations, approaching old questions from new angles. Dr. Chen, now ancient and gray but still sharp in mind, stood in the Grand Assembly Hall on Vraxi Prime. The building towered above her, so tall she had to crane her neck to see the ceiling. It was built in a style that perfectly mixed human and Vraxi architecture, creating something neither species could have imagined alone. Thousands of Vraxi filled the seats, their purple skin gleaming under the bright lights. They wore robes of office, symbols of their government and institutions. This was civilization in full flower. Today, the Vraxi Premier announced, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the vast space. We celebrate our coming of age as a species. Humanity gave us the greatest gift any species can give another, the gift of knowledge, the gift of civilization, the gift of the stars themselves. We are eternally grateful for what you have done. Sarah felt tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. This was everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for. This was humanity's legacy, written in the stars, not conquest like the empires of old Earth, not domination or exploitation, but creation, nurturing, sharing. This was what made humanity special. The Premier continued, and Sarah noticed his tone shifting slightly. And because we are truly grateful, because we understand the depth of what you have given us, we must now take the next step in our journey. We must learn to walk alone without your guiding hand. Sarah's smile froze on her face. A cold feeling spread through her chest. Humanity has been the most wonderful teacher any species could ask for, the Premier said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. But a student cannot grow forever in the shadow of their master. We cannot forge our own true destiny while humanity guides every step we take. We cannot discover our full potential while you watch over us like parents over children. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Around the hall, she could see other humans standing in shocked silence, their faces showing the same confusion and hurt she felt. Therefore, after much deliberation and soul-searching, the Vraxi Ascendancy has decided, unanimously and with great respect, that humanity must withdraw from our space. You have given us all the tools we need. You have taught us everything we require to continue alone. Now we must prove we can use these gifts. Your presence, however well-intentioned, however loving, diminishes us. We will always honor you. We will never forget what you did for us. But we cannot become ourselves, cannot stand as equals rather than students while you remain. The chamber erupted in Vraxi voices, all supporting their Premier with clicks and calls. Not a single dissent, not one voice saying humanity should stay, not one Vraxi standing to argue against this decision. Captain Rodriguez, now an admiral with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, clenched his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. After everything we've done? He whispered harshly to Sarah. After we gave them literally everything? After we spent a century of our lives raising them up? They're throwing us away like garbage? But Sarah understood even through the pain that felt like a knife in her heart. She thought of human children leaving home, of the biological necessity of independence. She thought of her own daughter, grown and distant, living her own life. It hurt when children left. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't that the goal? They had done their job too well. The Vraxi were ready to stand alone. The evacuation took 6 long months. Every human teacher packed their belongings, saying goodbye to Vraxi students who thanked them, but didn't ask them to stay. Every engineer gathered their tools, watching Vraxi apprentices take over their work without hesitation. Every scientist passed on their final lessons, seeing understanding in Vraxi eyes that no longer needed human interpretation. Every settler left homes they had built with their own hands, leaving behind lives they had created. The Vraxi were polite throughout the process. They were respectful. They thanked every departing human personally, holding ceremonies and giving speeches. But they were also firm. They did not waver. They did not ask anyone to reconsider. They did not offer compromises or exceptions. The decision was final and absolute. On the last transport leaving orbit, Sarah looked down at the glowing cities one final time. Vraxi ships filled the space around their world, beautiful vessels moving with confidence and purpose. They were utterly independent now, utterly capable. They didn't need humanity anymore. Maybe they never really had after that first crucial gift of knowledge. "We did the right thing," she whispered, though her heart ached with a pain she hadn't expected. "They're ready. They're whole. They don't need us anymore." Rodriguez sat beside her in the cramped transport, his face hard and bitter. "Then why does it feel like we've been used and thrown away? Why does it feel like we poured our hearts into something that just spit in our face?" Sarah had no answer. She watched Vraxi Prime shrink to a point of light, then disappear entirely as they jumped to hyperspace. The view shifted to the swirling colors of faster-than-light travel, and Sarah felt her stomach lurch. Humanity returned to their core worlds, carrying the news of their success and rejection. They told themselves this was what they had wanted all along. They told themselves the Vraxi were right to seek independence. They told themselves it was the price of good parenting, of successful mentorship. They told themselves they would do it all again, that other species deserved the same chance. They told themselves many things in the long journey home, trying to soothe the hurt. Some of those things were even true, but deep down, in places they didn't want to examine, they all felt the sting of rejection. They all wondered if maybe the conservatives had been right. They all questioned whether the pain was worth it. But humanity was stubborn. They were optimistic. They were determined to see the best in others. So they decided this was just one case, one unusual situation. Surely other species would be different. Surely other species would appreciate what humanity offered and want them to stay. They were wrong. But they didn't know that yet. The Delphari swam through their ocean cities with grace that made human observers weep at the beauty. Their bodies moved like liquid silver through the water, bending in ways that seemed to defy physics. The cities they built beneath the waves were marvels of architecture, combining functionality with artistry in ways humanity had helped them achieve. Humanity had given them fusion reactors that worked in the crushing pressure of deep ocean trenches. They had taught them mathematics and engineering adapted specifically for aquatic life, for creatures who thought in 3 dimensions without a surface to orient by. For 200 patient years, humans lived in underwater habitats alongside the Delphari. They wore pressure suits that made them clumsy and slow. They breathed through masks that limited their words. They moved awkwardly through the water that was the Delphari's natural home. But they endured the discomfort because they believed in the mission. They believed in sharing knowledge, in lifting others up, in making the galaxy richer through cooperation. Then came the ceremony of tides, a traditional Delphari ritual that dated back to their primitive days. The Delphari gathered in their millions in the Grand Trench, where the water was so deep that human suits groaned under the pressure. They sang their gratitude in harmonies that made human listeners weep, even through their confusion. The song spoke of debt and honor, of gifts received and lessons learned. Then they sang their goodbye. "The ocean is ours to explore," they sang in voices that resonated through the water. "We cannot swim in your shadow forever. You must go now, so we can find our own way through the currents." General Marcus Stone watched from the surface station as the last human habitats were towed away by heavy transport ships. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. "It's happening again," he said to no one in particular, his voice flat with disbelief. "They're doing exactly what the Vraxi did. The Kresh were fundamentally different from any species humanity had encountered before. They were a hive mind, spread across millions of individual bodies but sharing one consciousness. Teaching them had been one of the most challenging tasks humanity ever attempted. How do you communicate with a mind that thinks in swarms instead of individuals? How do you help a species that experiences reality in ways completely alien to human consciousness? But humanity had persevered. They spent 3 careful centuries learning to communicate, developing technology that let the Kresh collective consciousness span entire star systems. They helped the Kresh understand concepts that were foreign to a hive mind, like individual art and personal expression. In return, the Kresh taught humanity about consensus reality and shared experience. The Kresh built structures that looked like massive insect hives, but were actually sophisticated living computers. Each individual Kresh body was a node in a network of consciousness. They composed poetry where every word was spoken by a different body, creating performances that required thousands of participants. They mastered biotechnology in ways humans never imagined, growing their technology instead of building it. Then the great swarm gathered. Millions upon millions of Kresh bodies moved as one perfect organism, flowing across their capital city like a living river. They arranged themselves in patterns, their bodies forming words visible from orbit. The message was simple and absolute. Thank you. Goodbye. We must grow alone. Ambassador Chen, Sarah Chen's great-granddaughter carrying on the family legacy, stood in the center of the living message. She was surrounded by thousands of Kresh bodies, all perfectly still, all focused on her. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. We can still help you, she pleaded, knowing it was useless but needing to try. There's so much more we can share, so much more you can learn. But the Kresh were absolute in ways only a hive mind could be. Everybody spoke the same words at the same moment, creating a sound that was terrifying in its unity. Your thoughts contaminate ours. We cannot become ourselves while yours echo in our minds. Go with our love, but go. The lumens were crystalline beings who lived in the cold dark between their world and its distant star. They didn't have bodies in any way humans understood. They were patterns of energy trapped in crystal matrices, thinking in light pulses that moved faster than human consciousness. They perceived reality in colors humans needed machines to detect, in spectrums that ranged from radio waves to gamma rays. Teaching the lumens had required humanity to invent entirely new forms of mathematics. Traditional equations didn't work for beings who experienced time differently than biological creatures. Human scientists had to learn to think in non-linear ways, to understand causality from a perspective where past and future were more like suggestions than absolutes. The work took centuries, but the results were beautiful. The lumens built ships of living crystal that caught starlight and sang with it. They created art that existed in dimensions humans could barely perceive. They solved problems in quantum physics that had puzzled Earth's greatest minds for generations. They saw the universe in ways that expanded human understanding of reality itself. Then they refracted their message through every crystal surface on their world. The light patterns created words that appeared simultaneously across their entire civilization. We shine brightest in our own light. Your glow overwhelms ours. We must ask you to dim yourselves by leaving. The Sorrows were warriors, evolved from pack hunters on a harsh world where only the strong survived. Their culture was built on concepts of honor, strength, and dominance. When humanity found them, they were locked in endless tribal warfare, spending all their energy on conflicts that went nowhere. They were fierce and intelligent but trapped by their own nature. Humanity taught them carefully that strength could build instead of destroy. They showed the Sorrows that the greatest warriors were those who protected rather than conquered. They helped them channel their aggressive instincts into constructive purposes. It was delicate work, requiring humans who understood warrior cultures from Earth's own violent history. The Sorrows learned the lessons well. They became engineers and architects, using their fierce discipline to create wonders. They built cities of metal and stone that could withstand anything their harsh world threw at them. They wrote codes of honor that balanced their predatory instincts with civilization's needs. They reached for the stars with the same intensity they once used for hunting prey. But now they hunted knowledge instead of flesh. Then the Alpha Council gathered, bringing together every clan leader from across Sorrow space. They met in the arena of First Blood, where their ancestors had fought to the death. But now they gathered to speak, not fight. Every leader said the same words in perfect unity despite their traditional rivalries. We honor the pack that raised us, but a true warrior must prove themselves alone. Your protection makes us weak. We must face the universe without you, or we will never know our true strength. By the time the 5th Terran Assembly convened, Humanity was reeling from the psychological impact. 5 uplifted species, 5 rejections, 5 civilizations that humanity had poured hearts and souls and centuries into, all asking them to leave. The pattern was impossible to ignore, impossible to deny, impossible to explain away as coincidence. Dr. James Liu stood before a virtual audience of billions, watching from across human space. His face was haggard, aged beyond his years by stress and disappointment. His voice carried the weight of collective heartbreak. We have to ask ourselves the hard questions now. What are we doing wrong? We give everything we have. We ask for nothing in return. We sacrifice our time, our resources, our very lives, and they all send us away like we're something unwanted. The debate raged for months across human civilization. Psychologists studied the pattern, conducting research and writing papers trying to understand the phenomenon. Sociologists examined the cultural factors at play. Anthropologists compared the cases looking for common threads. Philosophers questioned humanity's fundamental approach to uplift, wondering if the entire concept was flawed. Maybe we're too helpful, some argued passionately. We solve their problems before they learn to solve their own. We rob them of the struggle that creates real growth. We make everything too easy. Maybe we're too different, others said thoughtfully. Our presence reminds them constantly that they didn't achieve this alone. They can never take full pride in their accomplishments while we're standing there. We're living proof of their dependence. Maybe they're just ungrateful, the bitterest voices claimed angrily. Maybe we've been naive fools wasting our time on species that don't deserve what we've given them. Maybe we should have listened to the conservatives who warned us this would happen. Entire human worlds fell into collective depression. Mental health facilities overflowed with people struggling to find meaning. Suicide rates climbed steadily upward. The great project that had defined humanity for 500 years was crumbling, and people didn't know who they were without it. Generations had grown up believing humanity's purpose was to uplift others. Now that purpose felt hollow and pointless. The political factions that emerged from the crisis represented fundamentally different visions of humanity's future. The benefactor faction insisted they had to keep trying, that giving up was not in humanity's nature. We can't abandon the mission just because it's painful, they argued. That makes us as alone as if we'd never met anyone at all. We have to keep reaching out, keep sharing, keep trying. The isolationists wanted to seal human borders and focus inward. Let them figure it out themselves, they said bitterly. We'll focus on making humanity greater, on solving our own problems, on building our own civilization. We owe them nothing, and they've proven they don't want us anyway. But it was Admiral Keiko Zhao who proposed something fundamentally different, something that would change humanity forever. She stood before the assembly in her dress uniform, decorated with medals from 100 worlds that no longer wanted her presence. Her voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. We're asking the wrong question, she said simply. We keep asking what we did wrong, how we failed, why they don't want us. But maybe we did everything right. Maybe this is just what happens when children grow up. They leave home. It's natural. It's healthy. It's what we wanted even if it hurts. So what do we do? Someone shouted from the audience, voice cracking with emotion. Just accept the pain? Keep putting ourselves through this? Joe smiled, but it was a hard smile, sharp like a knife's edge. No, we stop living on their worlds. We stop building our homes in places where we can be kicked out. We stop depending on their acceptance or approval. We take to the void itself, the space between stars. We build our civilization in the dark where no one can tell us to leave. Let's see them banish us from nothing. The proposal seemed insane to many. Humanity had always been planetary creatures, needing worlds beneath their feet and skies above their heads. Even their finest space stations orbited planets, relied on them for psychological comfort and resources. The idea of abandoning planets entirely was alien to human nature. But Zhao's words struck something deep in the collective consciousness. A species tired of rejection, a people looking for somewhere they could never be told to leave, a civilization that wanted to build something permanent, something that couldn't be taken away by ungrateful children. The vote was incredibly close, splitting humanity almost perfectly down the middle. Almost half wanted to stay the course, to keep uplifting species despite the pain, because that's what good people did. But the other half was tired in ways that went soul deep, tired of being thanked then dismissed, tired of building civilizations for others while their own people suffered. tired of pouring love into bottomless vessels that never filled. The motion passed by the narrowest possible margin, just a few percentage points. Humanity would attempt the impossible. They would leave planets behind entirely, building their civilization in the cold dark between stars. They would become something new, something that had never existed before. They would become the Voidwalkers. As the assembly ended and representatives filed out in troubled silence, Zhao looked out at the stars through the massive viewport. Somewhere in that darkness, 5 civilizations thrived on what humanity had given them. They thrived and forgot and pushed away the hands that had lifted them up. They lived comfortable lives and told themselves stories about their own greatness, conveniently forgetting the centuries of help that made it possible. "Let them have their precious independence," she whispered to the stars. "Let them keep their worlds and their pride and their convenient amnesia. We'll build something they can't reject because they can't even reach it. We'll make the void itself our home." She turned away from the window, her face set with determination. The age of humanity's heartbreak was ending. The age of humanity's transformation was about to begin. They had been rejected by their children, but they were about to become something those children couldn't imagine. They were about to become creatures of the void. The construction began in the dark spaces between stars, where no sun shone and no world turned beneath the feet. Admiral Keiko Zhao watched the first O'Neill cylinder take shape through the reinforced viewport of her command ship. It was massive beyond human scale, stretching kilometers in length. It spun slowly on its axis to create artificial gravity inside through centrifugal force. When complete, it would house 1 million people and never touch a planet's surface. "We're really doing this," her second officer said quietly, his voice filled with wonder and fear mixed together. "We're abandoning worlds entirely, giving up everything that made us human for thousands of years." Zhao shook her head firmly. "No, we're not abandoning what makes us human. We're abandoning the need for what others can take away. There's a crucial difference. Humanity isn't defined by dirt under our feet. It's defined by what we do, who we are, how we adapt." The cylinder was just the first of thousands. Across human space, the largest construction projects in history began simultaneously. Generation ships designed to fly forever without landing. Void stations that existed in the emptiness between systems anchored to nothing. Habitats built around captured asteroids, around harvested comets, around absolutely nothing but human will and engineering. It was an undertaking that boggled the mind. Trillions of tons of material had to be moved. Entire asteroid belts were systematically mined down to nothing, transformed from rocks into building materials. Comets were caught mid-flight and harvested for water and organic compounds. Dark matter collectors were developed that could pull energy directly from the fabric of space itself, making habitats independent of stars. The work took decades of focused effort. Many humans refused to leave their planets, clinging desperately to blue skies and solid ground and the weight of gravity that came from mass beneath them. They couldn't imagine life without weather, without seasons, without the comfort of a horizon. They thought the Voidwalkers were insane, throwing away everything that made life worth living. But millions embraced the void with religious fervor. They were the rejected, the bitter, the ones who had given everything to ungrateful children and had nothing left to lose. They were the ones who had watched their life's work ask them to leave. They were ready for something radically new, something that couldn't hurt them the way the uplifted species had. Dr. Yuki Tanaka led the biotechnology teams that carefully adapted humans for void life. She was adamant that the changes be minimal, nothing that would make void-born humans unable to recognize their planetary cousins, nothing drastic, nothing that would split humanity into different species, just small improvements that would make life in the void more comfortable. Better radiation resistance through enhanced cellular repair mechanisms, more efficient oxygen use in the blood, eyes that could handle a wider range of light levels without damage, bones that maintained density and low gravity. Minor changes, but ones that would add up over generations. "We're not leaving humanity behind," she insisted to the critics who called her work unnatural and dangerous. "We're becoming what we need to be to survive in our new home. Humans have always adapted to new environments. This is just another step in our long journey. The first void cities came online one by one, each a triumph of engineering and determination. Humans learned to live without weather, without the comforting rhythm of day and night cycles dictated by a planet's rotation. They learned to thrive without the psychological security of a world beneath their feet. They adapted to spaces where up and down were arbitrary concepts, where the only gravity was what they created themselves. They built massive solar collectors that captured light from distant stars, channeling that energy into their habitats. They created fusion reactors that powered entire cities, miniature stars contained by human technology. They mastered recycling until waste became a foreign concept. Everything was reused, reconstituted, repurposed. They needed nothing from planets, nothing from the civilizations that had rejected them. The Void Dwellers developed their own culture, distinct from planetary humans. They thought differently, moved differently, saw the universe from a perspective that planetary minds struggled to grasp. They were comfortable in ways and places that made planet-bound humans deeply uncomfortable. They were becoming something new while remaining fundamentally human. Then came the message from the Ethereals, and humanity faced a moral test. The Ethereals were the 10th species humanity had uplifted, though by that time the benefactor faction had grown small and tired. Most humans had lost their enthusiasm for uplift after 9 rejections. But some still believed, still held onto the dream of a cooperative galactic civilization. They had convinced enough others to try one more time. The Ethereals were energy beings, creatures without solid form who lived in the upper atmospheres of gas giants. They were patterns of electromagnetic force held together by quantum effects that physics barely understood. Teaching them had required developing entirely new branches of physics that bent reality in uncomfortable ways. But humanity had done it successfully. They had given the Ethereals the tools to build bodies of directed force fields, to create structures in their gaseous world that could withstand the violent storms. They had helped them reach beyond their cloudy home to the wider universe. It had taken 3 centuries of patient work. Now the Ethereals sent a desperate plea across the stars, a message that crackled with fear and urgency. Our sun is dying early. A stellar plague spreads through its core, a chain reaction we cannot stop. We do not have the technology to fix this. Please, humanity, we know we will ask you to leave when this is done. We understand the pattern. We know what we are. But please help us one more time. Our children will die if you do not. 700 years passed in the void, and humanity evolved in ways that went far beyond simple biology. They changed through culture and adaptation and necessity, becoming something that planets could never have produced. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The Void Collective numbered in the trillions now, a population that would have staggered the ancient humans who first looked up at the stars. They lived in thousands of mobile habitats, each one a city unto itself, capable of independent survival for centuries. They drifted through the dark spaces between stars like cosmic nomads, tethered to nothing, owned by no one, beholden to nothing but their own will. They had become ghosts in the cosmic machine, invisible infrastructure that held everything together. But they were not idle ghosts, not passive observers. They were active, essential, and more powerful than anyone realized. Captain Indira Vasquez piloted her trade ship through hyperspace with practiced ease, carrying manufactured goods from one void station to another, through dimensions that bent reality. Her ship was void-born, built by void dwellers in void shipyards, and would never touch atmosphere or feel gravity from a planetary mass. It was beautiful in its own way, all sharp angles and pure efficiency, designed by minds that thought in 3 dimensions without any ground beneath them to orient by. Approaching the Vraxi border, her navigator announced from his station, reading data that flowed across holographic displays, requesting permission to transit their space in the Vraxi, the first children, the species that started everything. They had thrived for 1,000 years since humanity left, building an impressive empire across 17 star systems. They had magnificent art, deep culture, sophisticated philosophy. They had everything humanity gave them, plus more that they created themselves through genuine innovation. But they didn't have what humanity had built in the void during those same centuries. They didn't have access to the deep technologies that void living required and inspired. The Vraxi traffic controller's voice came through the communication system, sounding young and bored. Permission granted, human vessel. Please stick to the marked hyperspace lanes. Welcome to Vraxi space. The tone was polite and professional, exactly what interstellar protocol required. But Vasquez noticed immediately what they didn't say. No thanks, no acknowledgement of shared history, no recognition of what humanity had done for them. To the young Vraxi manning the traffic control station, humans were just another species using the lanes. Nothing particularly special. The great uplifting was ancient history now. Mythology, if the young ones believed it at all. Most probably thought it was exaggerated or entirely made up. The marked hyperspace lanes were humanity's creation, maintained by human technology that the Vraxi used, but didn't truly understand. The mathematics alone required thinking in ways that planetary species struggled with. The Vraxi used the lanes constantly, but they didn't comprehend them. None of the uplifted species did, because while the children learned what humanity taught them and then stopped learning, humanity had kept pushing forward relentlessly. 7 centuries of living in the void, of pushing boundaries that planetary species couldn't even imagine. Human technology had advanced in directions that required thinking in void terms, in spaces without convenient reference points, in dimensions where intuition didn't work. Vasquez arrived at Vraxi Prime Station and efficiently offloaded her cargo. The station was genuinely impressive, covered in distinctive Vraxi architecture and beautiful art that spoke to their unique aesthetic sense. But it was built on a human framework, using human structural principles maintained by human systems that had become so ubiquitous, the Vraxi didn't even see them anymore. They were like fish unaware of water. "It's like being the walls," her navigator said quietly, staring out at the Vraxi moving through their station. "They live in the house but completely forget who built it. They think the house just exists naturally." Back in deep void space far from any star, the Void Collective Council gathered for an emergency session. 23 uplifted species now filled the galaxy, all thriving impressively on what humanity had given them centuries ago. They had formed something called the Galactic Consensus, a grand alliance of planetary civilizations that saw themselves as equals working together, and the consensus was about to make a catastrophic mistake born of pride and ignorance. Ambassador Torres attended the consensus meeting as humanity's official representative. She drifted naturally in zero gravity, while the other species sat in their carefully gravity-adjusted chambers, looking uncomfortable despite the accommodation. She was void-born, 3 generations removed from planetary life. Her body showed it. Bones that were lighter, more efficient blood chemistry, a frame adapted for weightlessness. She could never comfortably live on a planet even if she wanted to. The gravity alone would cripple her within months. The consensus chairman, a Lumens who had chosen the designation, Bright Sharp Victory, spoke in light pulses that were automatically translated to sound for the other species. "The motion before us is simple and fair. Humanity controls far too much of galactic infrastructure, the hyperspace lanes, the major trade routes, the communication networks that connect our civilizations. This situation is fundamentally unacceptable." Torres felt ice forming in her stomach. She had a sudden terrible premonition of where this was going. "We built those systems," she said carefully. "We maintain them constantly. We developed the underlying technology. What exactly is unacceptable about the current arrangement?" "Your monopoly," a Soros delegate growled, rising from his seat aggressively. "We are supposed to be equals in the consensus, yet we depend entirely on you for basic services that civilization requires. This creates an unfair power imbalance that violates our founding principles. We're politely asking you to share your technology." Bright Sharp Victory continued in a tone that suggested they were being very reasonable. "And to submit your infrastructure operations to consensus oversight and democratic control. This is only fair. Knowledge should be shared among equals." Torres actually laughed. She couldn't help it. The sound echoed strangely in the chamber, and she saw confusion on many faces. "Fair? You want us to simply give you everything we built over 7 centuries? The technology we developed while living in places you literally cannot survive? The systems we maintain with knowledge that took generations to accumulate? And you want democratic control over it? We're not asking anymore," the Delphari delegate said coldly, her translated voice devoid of warmth. "The consensus has already voted on this matter. 22 civilizations in favor, 1 opposed. You must share the technology and submit to oversight or face serious sanctions." "Sanctions?" Torres felt her carefully maintained patience finally snap like a frayed cable. "You'll sanction us? What exactly will you sanction? We don't live on your precious worlds. We don't need your trade goods. We don't require your approval. We exist in spaces you fundamentally can't even reach without our help." "We can reach anywhere we want," the Saros delegate said, standing to his full impressive height. "The consensus fleet is the most powerful military force in galactic history. If you refuse to cooperate, if you refuse to share what should belong to everyone, we will take what should be freely given. This is your final warning. Torres looked slowly around the chamber at all 22 civilizations represented there. Every single one owed their existence to humanity's patient work. Every single one had rejected humanity when they no longer needed teachers. And now, with breathtaking arrogance, they wanted to take what humanity had built in their exile. "You're actually serious," she whispered, genuine disbelief in her voice. "You're genuinely threatening us after everything." "We prefer to call it ensuring equality and democratic oversight," Bright Sharp Victory said smoothly. "You have exactly 1 standard month to begin compliance. We hope you'll see reason." Torres left without another word, her face carefully blank. She transmitted the news immediately to the Void Collective, and humanity responded in a way the consensus never expected, never even imagined possible. They did absolutely nothing. The consensus fleet launched exactly 30 days later with great fanfare and ceremony. 2,000 warships from 22 different civilizations, representing dozens of different design philosophies. It was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, an armada that could have conquered old Earth 1,000 times over. They divided into multiple task forces, each targeting what intelligence identified as major human void stations. Admiral Chen 12, commanding void defense from a station that existed in a dimension slightly sideways from normal space, watched the consensus fleet approach on sensors that detected things most species didn't know existed. "They really think this will work," he said with genuine amusement in his voice. "They think they can threaten us into compliance." "Should we prepare to fight them?" his tactical officer asked nervously, hands hovering over weapon controls. Chen 12 smiled coldly. "No, we don't fight. Fighting would imply they have something we want or need. Instead, we simply leave." The order went out across the entire Void Collective, through channels the consensus didn't know existed. Every habitat, every station, every Void city received the same simple instruction: move, go deeper, fade into the dark. The consensus fleets arrived at the coordinates of major Void stations expecting confrontation. They found absolutely nothing. Not debris from destroyed stations, not abandoned structures, not even sensor ghosts or radiation signatures, simply nothing at all. The massive habitats had moved, slipping deeper into dimensions and spaces where the consensus couldn't follow, couldn't even detect. And they took absolutely everything with them. The hyperspace lanes shut down first, all across consensus space simultaneously. Ships traveling between consensus worlds suddenly found themselves stranded in normal space. Their journeys that normally took comfortable days now taking decades or even centuries at sublight speeds. Thousands of ships found themselves trapped between stars with no way home. The communication networks went dark next. Civilizations that had grown dependent on instantaneous communication across light years suddenly found themselves isolated, cut off, unable to coordinate. It was like someone had cut all the telephone lines at once. The trade routes vanished. The carefully maintained paths through dangerous space that allowed safe commerce simply stopped existing. Pirates and natural hazards that had been suppressed for centuries suddenly became threats again. On Vraxi Prime, lights flickered ominously across the capital city. Their power grid relied heavily on human-built reactors, maintained by human systems, supported by human technology. Those systems stopped responding to commands. Engineers frantically tried to understand technology they'd used for centuries, but never truly comprehended. On Delphari Ocean World, deep underwater cities lost life support systems. The technology was human-designed, human-maintained, human-dependent. Without humanity's constant attention, it began failing in ways the Delphari couldn't fix. Water. Pressure threatened to crush habitats that had seemed invincible. Across all 22 civilizations, infrastructure collapsed like houses built on sand. Not catastrophically. Humanity wasn't actively cruel or genocidal. Life support stayed functional. Basic systems continued working. Food production continued. But everything advanced. Everything that made their civilizations great. Everything that let them span star systems and build empires and consider themselves advanced. All of it relied fundamentally on human technology, human maintenance, human expertise that they'd taken completely for granted. And humanity was gone, disappeared into the deep void like ghosts fading at dawn. The consensus military tried to follow, sending their proud warships deeper into void space. But planetary species couldn't survive there. Their ships weren't designed for it. Their crews couldn't handle the psychological stress of true emptiness. After 3 weeks, the fleet limped back to consensus space, having found nothing and achieved nothing. The war lasted exactly 3 weeks before the consensus sent a desperate surrender. Torres returned to the same chamber, but everything had changed. The delegates looked desperate now, their pride shattered by harsh reality. "Please." Bright sharp Victory's light dimmed with visible humiliation. "Our civilizations are collapsing. Systems are failing. We severely underestimated our dependence on your infrastructure. We were wrong. We were arrogant. We were foolish." Torres floated in the center of the chamber, perfectly comfortable in zero gravity while they struggled, in their gravity chambers despite the technology trying to help them. "You rejected us," she said simply, her voice echoing. "Every single one of you centuries ago. You called us shadows you had to escape. You sent us away from spaces we had built with our own hands, poured our hearts into. And when we went to the void where you couldn't reject us anymore, where we built our own civilization independent of you, you tried to take even that. You tried to steal what we built in exile." "We were afraid," the Delphari admitted, her voice small. "We didn't realize how much we still depended on you. How much we still needed you. We thought we were independent." "That's the fundamental problem," Torres said, her voice hard as steel. "You still think you need us. You don't understand that we don't need you at all. We're void dwellers. We exist in the spaces between your civilizations. You're entirely welcome to your planets and your systems and your grand consensus and your illusions of equality. But the void is ours. Absolutely and forever ours. That can never change." The Void Accords took 6 months of painful negotiation to finalize. Humanity would graciously return their infrastructure and resume maintenance, but on entirely new terms that reflected reality. The void belonged to humanity, absolutely and forever. No consensus authority could extend into it under any circumstances. No consensus law could touch it. No consensus oversight could apply. In exchange, humanity would maintain the invisible connections between worlds, the lanes through hyperspace that made interstellar civilization possible, the communication networks that held everything together. They would continue being the invisible foundation beneath galactic civilization. But they could never be rejected again, never be expelled, never be told to leave. Because you can't remove the foundation from a building without the building collapsing. And humanity had become the foundation itself. The galaxy learned a painful lesson. You can reject your parents when you're young. You can demand independence and send them away. But you can't reject the ground beneath your feet. You can't reject the walls holding up your roof. And humanity had become exactly that. The invisible, essential, absolutely critical foundation that everything else was built upon. The ungrateful children went back to their lives, properly chastened, and humanity disappeared back into the void where they were most comfortable. Silent and invisible and absolutely in control of everything that mattered. 1,000 years of peace followed the Void Accords, and humanity became something beyond what anyone had imagined. They transcended civilization as other species understood it, moving past culture into something that defied easy categorization. They became mythological in the truest sense. The Voidborn, some called them, with reverence and fear mixed together. The Star Shepherds, the Silent Guardians, the Watchers in the Dark. Children on consensus worlds grew up hearing stories about the mysterious beings who lived in the cold dark between stars, who maintained the invisible threads that held galactic civilization together, who appeared when needed and vanished when their work was done. Most people in consensus space had never actually seen a human in person. Humanity rarely visited planets anymore, finding the gravity oppressive and the atmospheres claustrophobic. They had evolved over the centuries, both culturally and physically, into something specifically designed for void life. The changes had accumulated gradually over generations until void-born humans were distinctly different from their ancient ancestors. Their bodies were taller and thinner, built for environments without gravity. Their bones were hollow like birds, making them light and fragile on planets but perfect for the void. Their eyes could see in near-complete darkness, adapted to spaces where starlight was often the only illumination. They could survive in hard vacuum for several minutes without suits, their bodies able to seal and protect vital functions temporarily. They were still recognizably human, still the same species genetically. But they were also fundamentally other, changed by 1,000 years of living where no planetary species could follow or survive. Lieutenant Kira Okonkwo stood on the outer hull of her ship, wearing nothing but a thin pressure suit that was more like a second skin than traditional armor. Magnetic boots held her to the metal surface while she performed routine maintenance. She was 4 generations void-born, the product of families who had never touched a planet. She had never breathed planetary air and had absolutely no desire to try. The void was home in every way that mattered. The cold, the dark, the endless silence. These were comfort, not threat. Her ship was beautiful in a way that defied planetary aesthetics. It was built without the constraints of atmosphere or gravity, all flowing curves and pure efficiency. It didn't have traditional decks or floors because there was no up or down in the void. It was simultaneously sculpture and machine. Moving through space with organic grace. Kira, you need to see this immediately. Her sensor operator called urgently through her helmet comm. She pulled up the data on her helmet display and felt her blood go ice cold despite her thermal regulation. That's not possible. The readings must be wrong, but the sensors didn't lie. They never lied. And the data was unambiguous and terrifying. Something was eating stars, consuming them entirely, extinguishing suns that had burned for billions of years. The anomaly appeared first in the galactic rim, far from populated consensus space where few bothered to look. A star that had burned steadily for 4 billion years suddenly went dark, winking out of existence like a candle flame. Then another star died, then 10, then 100, then entire clusters began going dark. The Void Collective watched with growing alarm, their sensors tracking the pattern of extinction. When the first inhabited consensus world went dark, its sun simply extinguished. Like someone had flipped a switch. Humanity realized they faced something beyond anything in their experience. The Harvester fleet emerged from the dark space between galaxies, traveling through dimensions that shouldn't exist. They were vast machines the size of small planets, built with technology that made human engineering look primitive by comparison. They moved methodically from star to star, extending tendrils of impossible technology directly into stellar cores, drinking the fusion fire that powered entire solar systems. Behind them, they left only darkness, systems without suns, worlds freezing as their heat sources vanished, civilizations dying in the cold and dark as their suns were consumed. The consensus sent their fleets to fight with typical confidence in their military power. 2,000 warships, the pride of 23 civilizations working together, approached the nearest harvester with weapons charged. They represented centuries of military development and cooperation. They fired everything in their arsenal: mass drivers that could crack planets, lasers that could vaporize asteroids, missiles with exotic warheads, weapons that bent the laws of physics. The Harvester didn't even acknowledge their existence. It continued its methodical work, draining the star of its energy, completely ignoring the attacks like a human might ignore raindrops or mosquitoes. The weapons that could destroy planets had absolutely no effect on its hull. When it finished consuming the star, it simply moved to the next system in its path. The consensus fleet followed helplessly, continuing to fire their useless weapons in growing desperation. On Vraxi Prime, now ancient and honored as the birthplace of the first uplifted civilization, the Premier called an emergency session of their government. "We need humanity," he said simply, his voice carrying through the chamber. "This threat is beyond anything we can handle alone." The chamber immediately erupted in argument. 1,000 years had passed since the last major crisis, and pride had returned with time and success. "We are the consensus," delegates argued passionately. "We are 23 advanced civilizations working together. We have technology, military power, scientific knowledge. We cannot go begging to the void dwellers like helpless children. Then we die in the dark with our pride intact." the Premier said flatly, cutting through the debate. Choose now. Send the message to humanity or watch our sun die. The request reached Void Station Omega, humanity's largest habitat and the unofficial capital of Void civilization. It hung in deep space, far from any star, a structure so massive it had its own noticeable gravity well. Fleet Admiral Sarah Zhao Torres, a direct descendant of both legendary leaders whose names she carried, received the message personally in her command center. They want our help, her second officer said, his tone carefully neutral but unable to hide the irony everyone in the command center felt viscerally. Of course they want our help, Zhao Torres replied, leaning back in her zero-gravity chair. They always want our help when things go badly. The question we must answer is whether we give it this time. The debate raged through the Void Collective for weeks, spreading across thousands of habitats and billions of people. Some wanted to refuse completely, to let the ungrateful children finally face the consequences of their pride and arrogance. Others argued that humanity had a moral responsibility to the galaxy, regardless of past treatment, but most fell somewhere in the complicated middle. We help, Zhao Torres finally declared after consulting with the Council. Not because they deserve it, not because they asked nicely or apologized for past treatment, but because we're humanity, and helping is fundamentally what we do, even when it hurts us. Even when we're rejected and insulted and used. We help because that's who we choose to be. The Void Fleet assembled in numbers the consensus had never witnessed. 5,000 ships emerged from deep void space, appearing on sensors like ghosts materializing from nothing. They were designed specifically for void combat, built to fight in environments and dimensions that planetary species couldn't even perceive. They looked strange and alien, angular and wrong, built for physics that planetary minds struggled to comprehend. Zhao Torres stood on the bridge of her flagship, appropriately named Rejection's Gift. She watched the harvesters ahead through displays that showed multiple dimensions simultaneously. Give me a tactical analysis, she ordered calmly. They operate partially in dimensions we can barely detect, her science officer reported, data flowing across her screens. They pull energy from stars through spaces that conventional physics says shouldn't exist. To effectively fight them, we need to engage in those same spaces. Good thing we've lived there for 1,000 years, Zhao Torres said with a cold smile. The battle of the dark reaches began in the space between stars, in dimensions the consensus couldn't perceive or understand. Human ships phased through reality itself, moving in directions that had no names in any language. They fired weapons that manipulated gravity on fundamental levels, that bent space-time into impossible configurations, that reached through dimensions to strike at targets that shouldn't be reachable. The battle lasted decades of subjective time for those fighting, though only months passed in normal space due to relativistic effects and dimensional distortion. Humanity fought in the deepest void, in places so empty and dark that most species would go insane from the isolation, in places where the harvesters thought they were completely safe from any possible threat. Human crews lived their entire lives in continuous combat. Generation ships bred new warriors who knew nothing but war, who were born, raised, trained, and died fighting an enemy that threatened all life in the galaxy. Children grew up on gunnery stations. Teenagers calculated firing solutions. Adults gave their lives to buy seconds of advantage. The cost was absolutely terrible. Millions of human habitats were destroyed, turned to debris and scattered atoms. Billions of people died in the cold vacuum or in explosions that briefly created new stars. Entire cultural groups were lost, unique traditions and knowledge wiped from existence. Families were shattered. Bloodlines ended. But humanity had one crucial advantage the harvesters never anticipated. The harvesters were used to fighting species that needed worlds that required light and warmth and solid ground beneath them, species that had homes to protect and couldn't leave them. They weren't remotely prepared for beings who lived naturally in the void itself, who thrived in complete darkness, who called the cold emptiness home and were comfortable there. One by one, the harvesters fell to human weapons and tactics. Human firepower reached into their dimensional hiding places and tore them apart from the inside. Human tactics adapted faster than the harvesters could adjust their defenses. Human determination, that legendary, stubborn, spite-driven determination that defined the species, simply refused to ever stop or give up. The final harvester died in a flash of impossible light that briefly illuminated 100 light-years of space. Its death throes rippled through 17 dimensions simultaneously, creating gravitational waves that would be detected for centuries. When the terrible light finally faded, the galaxy was safe from the extinction threat, and humanity was forever changed by what they had endured. João Torres stood in the shattered ruins of her flagship, atmosphere leaking from 100 hull breaches, emergency systems barely maintaining life support. Half her crew was dead, their bodies floating in compartments now open to vacuum. Around her position, what remained of the Void Fleet gathered slowly. Barely half the ships that had entered the battle returned. The consensus sent message after message of gratitude and praise. They offered rewards beyond measure, honors and titles, territory and resources. Literally anything humanity wanted. They called humans saviors and heroes and the greatest warriors in galactic history. They built monuments and wrote songs and created holidays. But humanity didn't answer for months. They were too busy mourning their millions of dead. Too busy trying to repair their shattered habitats. Too busy simply surviving the aftermath of apocalyptic war. When João Torres finally responded, exhausted and grieving, her message was devastatingly brief. We didn't do it for you. We did it because the galaxy is our home too. We live in the spaces between your worlds. If those spaces died, so would we eventually. Don't thank us. Just remember what it cost. Remember who paid the price. The consensus wanted to throw massive celebrations to honor their saviors with parades and ceremonies and public recognition, but humanity declined every single invitation without explanation. They retreated back into the void, back to the darkness they preferred and understood, back to mourning their losses in private. On Vraxi Prime, the premier, great-great-grandson of the one who had first rejected humanity so long ago, stood at his office window looking up at the stars that still burned because humanity had saved them. Somewhere in the dark between those points of light, humanity lived and suffered and rebuilt, protected the galaxy and asked for nothing in return. We rejected them, he said softly to his closest advisor, shame heavy in his voice. Every civilization they created, we all sent them away. We told them we didn't need them, didn't want them, and still they came when we called. Still they saved us at terrible cost. Perhaps that's what truly makes them humanity, the advisor replied thoughtfully. Not that they help when appreciated or thanked, but that they help anyway, even when rejected, even when used. They help because that's who they chose to become. In the void, humanity slowly rebuilt over decades. They mourned their staggering losses properly and learned from the brutal battle. They grew even stranger, even more adapted to the dark, even more comfortable in spaces that made planetary beings deeply uncomfortable just thinking about them. They became truly what 1,000 years of rejection had forged them into, neither planetary nor stellar, but something that existed in between. The Void's children forever and absolutely, young humans born after the war were taught carefully about the uplifted species, about the ancient pattern of rejection, about the great battles their ancestors fought. But they were also taught pride, not pride in being thanked or recognized, but pride in being absolutely essential, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. We are the foundation they build on, teachers said to students floating weightless in classroom habitats. We are the spaces between their worlds. They rejected us from their homes centuries ago, so we built our home in the rejection itself. And from that rejection, from that pain and exile, we became what the galaxy needed most. Beings who don't need gratitude or recognition to do what's right. The consensus civilizations thrived again. Their stars burning bright, their worlds warm and full of life. They told elaborate stories about humanity, myths that grew more exaggerated and fantastic with each passing generation. The silent guardians who watched from the dark, the void dwellers who could not be seen but were always present, the species that saved everyone and asked for nothing, wanted nothing, needed nothing from anyone. But humanity didn't care about the stories or the myths. They lived contentedly in the dark spaces, doing work no one else could do, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that made galactic civilization possible. They were forever apart from the species they had created and saved, forever essential to those species, forever unwelcome on their worlds. And they had learned over 1,000 years to be genuinely satisfied with that arrangement, because in the end they didn't need to be welcomed to belong. They didn't need to be loved to matter profoundly. They didn't need recognition to know their own worth. They just needed to be themselves. Stubborn, determined, impossible humanity. The ungrateful children slept safely and comfortably in their beds because rough humans stood ready in the void, watching and protecting. And if those children never thanked them, never truly acknowledged them, never welcomed them home, well, humanity had stopped needing that validation 1,000 years ago. They had the infinite void. They had each other and their own culture. They had purpose and meaning, and they had proven beyond any possible doubt that rejection could not break what it had actually forged into something stronger. In the deepest dark between the stars, humanity continued their eternal watch. Silent guardians, rejected children who became protectors. The foundation that could never be removed because removing it would collapse everything built upon it. The end, and yet also the beginning of forever.